Hi there and welcome to AXSChat. We're delighted to have Tim Springer with us today. Tim is the CEO of SSB-BART. SSB-BART are an accessibility company, very well known in the United States. But for those of us that live outside, Tim, can you tell us a little bit about SSB and how you came to be working in the accessibility field?
Sure. SSB BART Group does digital accessibility, usability by people with disabilities. And the idea behind that is when you're building a website, when you're building a web application, software application, pretty much anything, you want to make sure that people with disabilities can use those systems. And so what we do is help organizations to develop and implement things in a compliant fashion. And we do that by a combination of software, which is an underlying platform called AMP that allows you to make things accessible vis-a-vis the testing process, vis-a-vis the standards process, vis-a-vis the kind of knowledge management training process. And then on top of that software platform, we then build additional things, and the additional stuff that we build is generally services, so consulting services, and making sure that people with disabilities can then access the systems of these different organizations. I've got like a little echo. Are you guys hearing an echo too?
It's not bad. It's so much better than what we had before. So
Okay.
I think we're good. So
Okay.
can you tell us a little bit about what it was that brought you into working in the accessibility field?
Sure. So what's the deal? So way back in 1999, this is like in the middle of the dot-com era. So it's the dot-com boom. Everybody's starting companies. Pets.com is ascendant, all sorts of good stuff like that. So I'm a computer science guy. Went to school at Stanford. And so if you're in computer science at Stanford in the late 1990s, you start companies. And so me and a bunch of other folks decided, hey, it would be fun to start a company in general. Based on wanting to start a company, one of the things that had come up is someone had said, hey, it'd be great if I could know where I could go when I travel that was accessible. So I got in a wheelchair, and I was like, I can't find a website that'll tell me what museums I can get into, what restaurants I can get into. So we were like, the bulb goes off. It was an amazing, brilliant business plan, and so we launched this organization called Empowered.com, and it was designed to provide information to travelers with disabilities. And then as we developed the site, the issue of digital accessibility came up. We essentially saw different organizations needing to also make their sites accessible. And so the concept was really nothing more complicated than, hey, instead of making this one website accessible, why don't we make all of the websites accessible? And then there's an entire business narrative that goes with that involves making every possible mistake in starting and running a company, learning from those mistakes, iterating, and sort of growing and evolving along the way. And so that leads you to sort of where we're at now with SSB BART Group, which is one of the dominant sort of digital accessibility providers that's out there. We do a full scope of solutions, as I mentioned, including software, consulting, training solutions. We do that across desktop, mobile, electronic document systems, and more and more looking really to help our customers solve that on a global basis.
Okay, Antonio, I know you've got a question.
Yeah, no. My question is no focused basically on the one of the reasons that you end up moving to that direction is trying to fix the web, trying to fix websites and make all websites accessible. Now in social networks we have this challenge between tools like LinkedIn, Facebook, Medium, and many other who are supposed to be able to be accessible to a broad audience, and even so they struggle to have their sites accessible and to allow people to use their platforms in a manner that they can actually take advantage of it. Why do you think this is still going on, especially in companies that have such a high profile?
It's a complicated question. There isn't a simple answer to that question, but basically I would break it down into factors of the business drivers that companies face. So let's assume that all of the companies you mentioned and really private enterprises in general behave logically, like they behave in a reasonable, logical fashion. And while there are other things that private entities do, right? Most private corporations are there to provide a positive return to their shareholders, and they're profit-seeking organizations. That doesn't mean they're evil. That doesn't mean they're bad. I'm not implying any of that. It's just that that's what the function is. That's technically what a corporation does, is it provides a return to the shareholders. So drill down on that one more level. Essentially what I would say is if they're not building accessible features in, or they're not providing a level of accessibility that's sort of needed in the market or that users need to react to, there's probably some financial incentives that aren't aligned with that. So financially it doesn't seem to be in the interests of the company to do that. And so then if you drill another level down on that, the question then is, why do people make things accessible? And essentially in accessibility, historically, we've seen two arguments. One argument is the compulsory argument. You do it because you have to do it. And that's a driver based on either the legality of the situation, the market requirements of the situation, or sort of the brand concerns, the concerns about reputational risk. But it's really like a risk management activity. And then the other side of it is, well, people with disabilities represent this gigantic market, and it's an untapped market potential, and you need to implement accessibility to provide access to people with disabilities, and if you do this, it'll lift the market penetration that you have. You'll make more money, you'll grow your revenue. And so if you think about that from a business perspective, that's basically two arguments. One argument is a cost argument, which is the compulsory argument, which is to say, hey, look, you're going to spend money on this, and so you need to proactively spend money on accessibility, make it accessible, because otherwise it's going to cost you money in lawsuits, or it's going to cost you money market risk. And the other one is sort of a positive or a revenue-based argument, which is to say, well, if you sell to this broader market, you're going to make more money. And my response to you, and I know this is sort of a long way to get there, is the cost side of the equation only recently has become much more significant. So only in the last couple of months in the United States have organizations really looked at it and said, hey, there's a real chance that we're going to get sued if we're not going to provide access to our users, to our customers. And that is still at a very, very early stage. So one reason organizations aren't fully accessible is that that cost is not significant enough for them to make a material investment in it. They can make a passing investment in it, but to really fundamentally ensure that all of the information technology they're producing is accessible, they don't have enough money to spend in that. So that's on the cost side of the equation. And on the revenue side of the equation, the markets really just aren't that significant from most people's viewpoints. And I don't think as accessibility advisors, we've done a good job of defining that market in a credible fashion and then also supporting that with data. So I've seen a lot of slides that say things like, if you make your application accessible, you'll have access to an $87 trillion market size. And most people look at those and they're like, you're crazy. They would use stronger language than I'll use in this because it's a family-friendly chat. But it's just not credible. And so to really be able to build those market numbers up, we have to be credible. And then in addition to that, we have to have it supported by the actual use data of the site. So it's a long answer to a short question, but it's a long answer because it's complicated, and there's a lot of different market dynamics at play.
But it's a good to see that answer from your point of view. We have similar push and pull factors in other markets. Obviously, the US market has its own particular focus around legislation, and we've talked at length before about whether or not the US is too litigious. You seem to be of the view that there's not been enough cases yet, although those cases are growing in number. And I think that it's true from my point of view in the UK as an observer that we need the test cases in order to be there to act as pointers to organizations that don't really understand that there is a risk of not doing it. I agree with you about the idea that we need to be putting together really good business cases and not just putting a finger in the wind and saying, oh, well, if you multiply X number of disabled users by, their potential income, then you end up with this kind of huge number. That said, I think that the market is large, but it is fragmented. And what we haven't done is dealt with that fragmentation and understood how we can look at the specificity of dealing with some of that fragmentation and how we can map that to the business case. Because I think we do need to make the good business case. I don't think that the cost of accessibility is as high as companies think, because I'm delivering it within large companies. But the cost of doing it after the fact, which you will see a lot of, I'm sure, is expensive. So you'll go in and you'll assess products that are already there. So you're retrofitting, and the cost of retrofitting is high. I'll absolutely say, absolutely. Then it's going to be a drain on companies' finances, and they won't want to do it. You'll have to drag them kicking and screaming to do the work. So Deborah, I know you've got a question. I've been rattling on for a while.
Well, I would say that I think that Tim brought up some really good points, and I think that I would like to clarify that I don't think that Tim did say that he thought that there should be more cases in the United States. I only say that because I know that a lot of times people looking into the United States, they might think some of us in the field want to have a lot more cases, and that's not really what we want. And I would just say, the other day I was talking to an attorney, and he said, and he was defending why he is actually one of the lawyers that is suing corporations, and we were debating this. And he said to me, you know how it works, Deborah? We put legislation on our books, and then the corporations don't follow them, and then the lawyers step in and we sue them and we make them follow the law. And he said, and none of these cases are going to drive these companies out of business, and they should be going ahead and making things accessible anyway. And so, as Tim noted, the cases are just, I agree with what he's saying, they're on the rise in the United States. The litigation cases, we've never seen the numbers, and the numbers are going to continue to rise and rise and rise. I think both of you also made another really good point. A lot of times when we're talking about the business case of including people with disabilities from all of the perspectives, but certainly the perspective of ICT accessibility, we use really bad data. Well, you're leaving, I liked Tim's numbers, quadrillions of dollars, you're leaving, $750 billion, trillion on the table. Well, really, are you really leaving that on the table? I don't think so. And then in the same breath, we say in the United States, 74% of people with severe disabilities aren't working. So it's like, wait a minute, I'm confused. Which is it? Are you all wealthy and you're not going to do business with us, which we don't see happening, or are you all living below the poverty? So our business case, many of the business cases don't make sense, and I know that Tim will agree with me on that. But it's a very interesting market right now in the United States, and I think that what's happening in the United States is going to continue to grow the global market, because I believe part of the problem with the reason why corporations, just speaking from a corporate perspective, are not becoming compliant to accessibility, or they're not blending accessibility into their processes, is a lot of times they're told to do it in a manual way. That's why I think you need some of the tools that SSB offers. And we want to bring it back to you, Tim, to obviously this is a topic that we're all very passionate about, but tell us a little bit about why you built AMP, and what is AMP doing to help take this very manual process and blend it in so that people can actually be successful in an automated way.
Yeah, so I'll give you a couple concepts on AMP, and then there's a couple talking points earlier that may be interesting and profitable for us to talk about. So AMP is the Accessibility Management Platform, and it's an underlying software platform that lets you manage a digital accessibility program. And if you look at most digital accessibility programs, they tend to do a few things pretty well. One thing they do well is testing, and testing is at varying levels of formality. So that can be quick tests during the development process. It can be testing by QA in an informal fashion. It can be testing by QA in a formal fashion. Testing by people with disabilities, using assistive technology to do use case and acceptance testing. And then also like full formal compliance auditing for WCAG, kind of a primary example of that. So AMP manages all of that. We have both workflow and then automation that goes into that. We also manage this concept of standards compliance, which is to say that most organizations that we work with are larger organizations. They have a bunch of different development technologies they use. So they have web technologies, they've got electronic document technologies, PDF, Word, Excel. They then also have different mobile platforms they deploy on iOS, Android, some secondary platforms, etc. And so how to design, develop, and test on each of those platforms is a matter of specification. So we manage all those different things across all those platforms, so enterprises can then look and say, hey, look, here's how all these pieces go together. And then we have a variety of different monitoring and reporting layers that sit on top of that. So how do I get good data out of my program? How do I determine what's wrong and what's right? And then we're also starting to roll out a lot of different enterprise integrations. So if accessibility sits in its own silo, that's not good. You want to take your accessibility software and platform and integrate it with your internal enterprise systems. That's stuff like Jira, that's stuff like HP, ALM, different systems like that. And then finally, there's also this aspect of fixing, which is streaming fixes from the servers. One of the industry standard terms for that is an overlay. That isn't purely technically concise, but that is also some technology that can be used to sort of address things after the fact. The deal with the market at a really, really high level is that customers want to buy a fully automated solution for accessibility. And the reason for that is it is a profoundly compelling story to tell to a customer. Like, a customer really likes the idea that I can buy software and that I'm done, but that's not true. And so that's like the challenge you get in the market is you have to sell software that can automate the portion that can be automated of the problem. And to be honest, it's about a third of the problem that can be automated from a discovery perspective, from a testing perspective. There are some things you can do to make it a little better, but really, broad terms, about a third of the problem you can kind of automate, and then about 2/3 remains a manual software development lifecycle issue. And so that's sort of the thing that you'll see in the market the most is, again, the concept of an automated tool being a panacea, being able to fix everything, is amazingly compelling because it's really mentally simple for people to understand. But it just isn't the case. Yeah, that's it. People want it all day long, right? Yeah. I want to sign a check and be done. I get it.
That's my problem's gone away now, right? I'm compliant. So I wrote a piece around whether or not middleware was effectively snake oil. I don't think it is. I think that there's potential use cases where it has a real benefit, but I do think that you're right in saying that there's only so much the software can do, and that a lot of it is requiring companies to actually buy into the idea of running a program, and not just a software program. It needs to be, you've talked about working with Jira, and you've talked about working with things like HP Quality Center and all these kind of bits that the organization is using to make sure that its output is good in the first place. But that also requires a mindset. So I know that I'm a big believer in organizational accessibility maturity models. I know that this is something that you guys are also advocating. I work with the Business Disability Forum, so they've done quite a bit of work in this area. And I think that it's one of those things where accessibility is a journey. We're all on it. Some of us are further down the road than others, but none of us has reached the end point yet. I think there's, even organizations that are considered to be best of breed, there's still more that we could do because the needs around accessibility are so varied. I know that Antonio's got a question, and then then Deborah has as well. So I'm going to hand over to Antonio. Sorry for calling you Dave. I think that's the painkillers kicking in.
No. Before you were showing us your Fitbit, and that's just just to start the conversation there. Today we see a lot of conversation about Internet of Things, virtual reality, machine learning. In your perspective, what will be the impact of all those technologies in future developments in accessibility?
So different technologies, different answers. So Internet of Things, we broadly define as any sort of IP-connected device. And to make it overly broad, let's just go ahead and assume that my Fitbit qualifies in that category. So Internet of Things we're really bullish on. We really like it. We think it's going to have a very profound and positive effect on the lives of people with disabilities. And our logic on that is simply that there are much better solutions and platforms for control. So I'm going to try to do this with videos. So like, this is not really an accessible piece of hardware, right? It's not really going to work from a touch perspective. It's not really going to work from a voice perspective. But if I take like this and I combine it with this, I have a really accessible infrastructure here, right? Because my cell phone has everything I need to get access on it. It's integrated into the operating system, and there's a variety of multimodal control factors, i.e. I can have voice and audio control over it. I actually can have touch control over it, right? If I wanted to have my watch integrated with Siri, I'd have sort of pure voice control over it as well and an audio output. And so our view of it is that if you take an inaccessible piece of hardware that would be profoundly expensive to make accessible in a sort of native out-of-the-box format, and combine it with an accessible application on a smartphone platform, you really have a very accessible overall infrastructure. So we view these kind of smart devices, Internet of Things, wearable things, in a really positive light. And we see a lot of convergence on the dominant mobile operating systems, particularly iOS and Android at this point, which in the fullness of time may also grow to include some other platforms like Windows. But we view those as having really robust accessibility capabilities. There's also a bunch of regulatory reasons why those platforms need to have accessibility capabilities built in, based on some esoteric points of U.S. law that I won't get into. But the point is, we think that those investments are compelling long-term and they're not going anywhere, that really will see the accessibility, which is already pretty good, improve further and further. So that's really focused on Internet of Things and wearable technology, which we're very bullish on. Virtual reality, we haven't seen, and we're not really so sure about what the application is for accessibility. That one we're kind of neutral on to see where it plays out. Like, I'm a geek, so I love it. I think it's going to be awesome. I don't know about the utility it will have. With that said, augmented reality, which is the ability to overlay information on sort of real-world spaces, that we think will have an amazing effect on people's lives. And the combination of visualization via augmented reality as well as secondary audio inputs and spatial audio inputs, basically being able through stereo headsets to be able to essentially communicate to the brain where a sound is in 3D space. Those are all out-of-the-box functionalities we expect to come from augmented reality platforms. We expect the augmented reality platforms to be pushed in a major mainstream way. And so we think that has the potential to make some amazing assistive technology, and that assistive technology platform is driven based on the same market dynamics that made the mobile platforms accessible, which is that there are these huge, huge markets driving miniaturization, costs, all the good stuff in those platforms. And so if you look at the kind of prime public example right now is Microsoft HoloLens for augmented reality. I mean, it has insane functionality. It is an amazing, amazing technical platform. And Microsoft's aware of accessibility issues. They're thinking about them proactively. So we think that platform has the chance to really, really have a big positive impact on people's lives. And kind of then ultimately that platform, right, combines with the mobile platform. And you have, you know, a flexible platform for assistive technology, essentially, that goes with you anywhere, that's more powerful than, you know, a 1980s supercomputer, has a battery that lasts all day long. I mean, you can start to see where it has really, really big impacts on independence and function, as well as kind of just societal participation. One other note I'd give you, and I don't want to get too far off on this, we talked a little bit before about sort of litigation versus non-litigation in the U.S. space. And people will, I think, appropriately criticize the U.S. as sort of an overly litigious society. What I found is a lot of times that distracts from the real issue, which is most people in accessibility tend to agree about one fundamental thing, which is participation in society is a fundamental civil right. And that's what we all get back to. And then what I found in sort of my travels and accessibility is that different societies just do that in different ways. In the US, we do it with legislation and litigation. That's just kind of how the system is set up here. But other societies will do that in a different way, and other cultures will do it in a different way. But it's really just, you start from that base of the tree, and then you figure out, well, how do we implement that in society? And what's neat is we live in a time where that concept has been enshrined in international treaty law with the UNCRPD. And so we kind of see how that then precipitates into different societies and different ways. So that's kind of where I try to keep that conversation at, less purely about litigation, although there are some positives and benefits, more about, hey, like, it's civil rights, and then the question is, well, how do we just get those civil rights into actual practice?
Well said, Tim. Tim, I am also a technology geek. I believe everybody on this video is a technology geek. But I think something, and of course I know a lot about SBBART groups because the company I founded, Tech Access, was actually merged with SBBART group in 2011, so I'm very familiar with what y'all have done. But of course, something that's very near and dear to my heart is employment of people with disabilities. And since I know a lot about SSB, I know that you are employers of people with disabilities and have been for many years. I also know that even though you're very strong in the United States, you also do have a global presence. And so I would like, if you wouldn't mind just talking a little bit about that, from, like we're saying, the Internet of Things and the wearables and the augmented virtual reality and all the things that are going to improve the lives of persons with disabilities. But at the same time, I think it really opens up a lot of employment opportunities, and SSB is a best practice. I'll tell you, Atos, the company that Neil and Antonio work at, they're also employing people with disabilities, so I really applaud the companies. But would you mind just speaking to that for a few minutes?
I mean, my kind of view on the employment opportunities for people with disabilities is that it's too exceptional right now. And what I mean by that is people look at it and they're like, oh, we employ people with disabilities. We think that's great. But to some extent, that's like a failure, right? We should just employ people. And if some of them have disabilities, great. And if some of them don't. But that's, candidly, right, we're not there yet. And so then the question is kind of like, well, what's the gap? Our view of the gap, and this is really going to be like office workers mostly, which is kind of our background, is fundamentally a huge chunk of the information technology stack is just not accessible out of the box. And if you were to go into an average work office environment, kind of like SSB, it's a cubicle farm. If you were to go in there, you would see a lot of people that are sitting there working on laptops, working on computers, and the software that they're using may or may not be accessible. With that said, 10 years ago, it was a nightmare. Now it's a lot better, and my hope is 10 years from now it'll be, out of the box. A lot of the stuff works, and I'm actually fairly bullish on that for a couple of reasons. One, the legal reasons we talked about before, and the drivers, but also the bigger reasons are demographics. So the population's getting older in the developing world, or sorry, the developed world. The developing world is actually getting older as well. And so we see the aging population starting to drive a lot of that because the population is getting older and people are working longer. And they're working longer to some extent because they need to work longer based on where sort of the fabric of society is. But also a lot of people want to work longer, and they want to work into their 60s and 70s. And as age goes up, disability incidence rates goes up, but also non-reported disability rates go up a lot. And so we see that sort of overarching demographic trend starting to really drive accessibility, particularly in the workplace, and that then supports sort of more acute disability modalities. So that'd be kind of my comments on employment, which is, I think it's critical. Outside of that, we like diversity for diversity's sake at SSB. We got lots of people. We got lots of people that have different levels of abilities. They have different backgrounds. Different approaches to a lot of different things. And we find that just makes more robust decisions and makes it a more compelling work environment for people to really work and play in. So that's kind of comments on employment. On a global basis, where we're going, yeah, we do quite a good book of business outside of the U.S. we as a company are aggressive in terms of acquisitions and looking at different acquisitions. It's a little bit different than some of the other players in the accessibility space. We think there's really a big opportunity to build a at-scale global player. There's a bunch of financial reasons why that makes sense for the principals involved. There's also just really a lot of customer service reasons that make sense. Working with larger firms, they really want 24/7 support. They want to have that support be consistent. And so that's where we're trying to go as a company, is really become the dominant player in digital accessibility solutions on a global basis and be able to really service large enterprise customers 24/7, 365. Which all is to say, if you have your accessibility firm and you want to come partner up with SSB, give me a call and let me know.
Yeah, well, we're also working for a large and acquisitive company, probably on a slightly different scale, in that accessibility is just one small part of what we do. We're one of those large enterprises, so we've got 100,000 employees. but yeah, we're pretty big. We've got 10,000 in the US, so we're definitely believers like you that accessibility is something that's here to stay. That the demographics are going to drive it further forward, and like you, when we're dealing with it in the enterprise context, we see that the vast majority of people who are using or have need for accessibility, and a lot of the stuff is not the JAWS or the Zoom text stuff, but the smaller, the keyboard access, the color contrast, and all of the more subtle stuff that's also very important, and not people that consider themselves to be disabled.
Going back to the overlays discussion, there's an interesting observation I'd heard in the market. So you have products like SiteQues, product like BrowserLab, ReadSpeaker, a bunch of these different reading software. And initially, I looked at these products and I was like, I'm really skeptical. Like, I don't buy it. I don't really see that they have the use. But then I heard the argument, which is that, well, there are a lot of people that could benefit from assistive technology that would never use it. And it turns out, if you actually look at the data that comes back from the use of those products, people do use them on sites. And that was interesting to me. It's like, I would never have thought of that. But then when people actually showed, it's like, well, actually, it's like, it is some people with disabilities, but it's really people that have, maybe minor reading impairments. It's people that are ESL. It's people that are, or whatever SL. So there's actually a much broader use profile there, which is interesting. And I think the demographics will drive that more. It's people that don't identify as having a disability, but can really have a big benefit. And then from accessible technology, and then what's neat about that is, if we deploy that technically in a proper fashion, we can actually have hard data on use of those things and be able to show, hey, look, we deployed magnification to your site, and we increased usage of the site by 4%. Well, 4% doesn't sound much, but 4% of 100 million people is actually a huge amount, and there's a lot of work people would do to chase a 4% increase at that scale.
Absolutely, and that really hard data is exceptionally important, because, as we said before in this discussion, a lot of the figures that are bandied about are just conjecture. I think that we're close to the end of our half hour, so Deborah, do you have one final question before we close?
I think that Antonio had a question, so we can.
You were talking about employment. What I would like to know from your team is, when you hire someone and you want that person to fit into the company culture, are you doing any type of induction? How do you move that person that comes sometimes from an area where accessibility was not something that they were dealing with every day, to a company that has that at their core business?
So we have a significant onboarding process, is the process that we use. And we basically put people through what ends up being about a 2 to 3 week boot camp. And so the first week of the boot camp, we actually help them understand the mission, the vision of the company, what we're trying to accomplish, how do we actually translate that mission and vision into reality, where we're at now, but then also where we're going in the future. And for us, a good match for the company is somebody that buys what our current business is, but also buys where we as an organization want to go and where we want to help society go to. And so that's kind of about a week. And then from there, we split things out based on the actual role and then do domain-specific or role-specific activities. One of the things we've had to get very good at as a company is taking people that don't know accessibility but do know development, particularly development of web systems, and then training them on accessibility. Our historical experience, and this is not meant as a criticism of anyone in the industry in any fashion, but our historical experience has been that there are a lot of people that know accessibility, and since I'm in video, I can use air quotes. They know accessibility, but they don't really have technical depth in actually implementing accessibility. And so to make a long story short, what we've actually found is it's a lot easier for us to take people that are good developers, like they know HTML, JavaScript, and CSS particularly, and then put them through a pretty rigorous training process on accessibility, partner them up with more senior folks on accessibility, and have them run the process that way, versus taking somebody that kind of knows accessibility but doesn't know development and trying to get them to actually be able to provide good advice to developers, which doesn't mean you can't do the other one, but it's a much, much more time-consuming process. So to answer your question concisely, yeah, we both have a very, very clear sense of who's going to like working here, and then also the onboarding process. And then outside of that, it's company culture. You know, we have a really specific company culture. We make zero apologies about it. We will be very upfront about what works here and what doesn't. Another one of the CEOs in the space had a particularly funny comment. He's like, "You're like SSB." He's like, "You're kind of like the Borg." He's like, "You force people to assimilate." And I was like, "Yeah, like we are." And you actually, if you study great companies, they actually are all like that. So we find people that really have a passion for accessibility, want to do it at a big scale, and want to really have an impact, but are comfortable working hard and really at the end of the day know their stuff. They got to be technically proficient. They got to be technically good, because otherwise they're just not going to have that much value. But yeah, if we find somebody that fits there, they tend to really like it here, and it tends to be a very good match for them.
Okay, grand. Okay, so we're at the end of our half hour. So thank you very much, Tim. It's been
Sure.
a really informative chat. Look forward to you joining us on Twitter tomorrow night.
All right, we'll see you guys then.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you, Tim.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.